Section 6.7 talks about imaginary numbers, and where imaginary numbers are defined as I is equal to the square root of negative 1. Okay, and we know that a square root of a negative answer is not possible, and that's what the imaginary part of this is. But let's assume that we can take the square root of a negative number. If the square root of negative 1 is I, then that means that I squared is equal then to just negative 1. So as we go through and work through examples and keep in mind these two values, example number 1, if we have 3 times the square root of negative 4, and we need to simplify this down, the very first thing we're going to do is recognize that this is the square root of 1 times the square root of 4. So the square root of negative 1 is I. The square root of 4 is 2. And so this would be 6i as our answer. Example number 2, simplifying the square root of negative 45. Again, this is the same as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 45. So if we recognize that anytime we have a negative under the radical, the square root of negative 1, that's going to be I. Square root of 45 simplifies down to the 3 square roots of 5. So our answer is 3i square roots of 5. Example 3, if we have a negative that starts out in front of the square root of negative 27, these two negatives do not cancel each other out. They mean two different things. This I underneath the radical, this negative underneath the radical is an I. Taking just the shortcut, instead of having to write the square root of negative 1 and then changing it to I, this negative comes out, and so we have a negative I square roots of 27. Square root of 27 is 3 square roots of 3, so we end up with a negative 3i square roots of 3. Notice where the I is placed in our radical. Because it is representing a radical, putting it in front of the square root of 3 just makes sense. So it's going to be a negative 3i square roots of 3. Example 4. Let's say that we're squaring. If I have the square or the quantity 5i or the product 5i squared, that means 5i times 5i, which is 25i squared. Because I squared is a negative 1, this is equal to a negative 25. Number 5. If I have a negative and then I square roots of 2 squared, okay, this is a negative and then I square roots of 2 times I square roots of 2. This product is going to be I squared times 2. Well, I squared is a negative 1, so we have a negative times a negative 1 times 2. So now I end up with a positive 2. Example 6. What if we have an I taken to a power higher than 2? This really is 2i times 2i times 2i, which is 8i cubed. Anytime that we have an exponent on I greater than 1, we know we can simplify this down. I cubed is I squared times I. So if I take 8 times I squared times I, this is 8 times a negative 1 times I, which is a negative 8i. So anytime that you have an exponent on I, you need to simplify that down. Example 7. What if our I, or imaginary number, falls in the denominator? Keep in mind, this is a radical here. And if there's a radical in the denominator, we rationalize. Now, the 3 isn't a radical, so just rationalizing means that we're going to take care of just the I. So this is 4i over 3i squared. That I squared is going to give me negative 1. So this is a negative 4i over 3. This I squared being a negative 1 is just going to come out to the front. And example number 8, if I have a negative square root of 8 over the square root of negative 10. Very first thing I'm going to do is take this negative and bring it out. So I have a negative square root of 8 over I squared root of 10. Simplify radicals. So if I take a 2 out of this, this is a square root of 4. This is square root of 5. So now what I have is a negative square root of 4 over I square root of 5. Square root of 4 is 2. So if I'm going to go through and rationalize this, I'm taking this times I square root of 5. So I have I square root of 5 over I squared times 5. The I squared is going to be a negative, which changes this negative to a positive. So I'm going to have 2 I squared roots of 5 over 5. So this I squared and this negative are going to cancel each other out.